Good evening. I'd like to call the order of special meeting of the Woodland Park Planning Commission for Thursday, June 29th. Roll call, please.
Chair Hartsfield,
Here.
Vice Chair Brown,
Here.
Don DeZellem,
Here.
George Jones,
Here.
Ken Kennedy,
Here.
and then Larry Larson and Sean Nielsen are absent this evening.
So we do have a quorum. Very good. Please join me in the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. No, I didn't. All right, we have the approval of minutes from the June 8th Planning Commission meeting. Any comments or corrections? Seeing none, guess I'd move to approve the minutes. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, adopted as submitted. We have one public hearing tonight. And for the procedures, we'll have the presentation from staff. We'll take questions from commissioners to staff. And then open the public hearing with a 5-minute limit on comments, both in person and online. And then we'll have further discussion and questions as necessary. And then debate how we're going to proceed on the issues. So our public hearing is to consider an ordinance amending Title 5 and 18 of the Woodland Park Municipal Code concerning business regulations and zoning to license and regulate short-term rentals. Karen.
Thank you. Give me a moment while I queue up the presentation. And I know a number of us are fairly familiar with the topic since we've been spending a fair amount of time with it, but I am going to do a little bit longer presentation to just capture the ordinance as a whole and what's going on. So bear with me. The chair announced the title of the ordinance. So we're looking at amendments to Titles 5 and Title 18. Title 5 relates to licensing, and Title 18 is related to zoning, which is where Planning Commission has direct purview and is required to make recommendations before anything goes to City Council for their final decision. So the issue of short-term rentals was identified approximately 2 years ago. Short-term rental is essentially the renting of either a part of a residence or the whole residence for less than 30 consecutive days. Our current city regulations do not explicitly address this type of rental in any zoning district. So that term short-term rental is not explicitly defined or utilized in our current regulations. This type of an item that you were reviewing this evening is considered legislative since it's actually changing the code as opposed to an item that would be quasi-judicial where you're applying regulations to a specific piece of property. So it really is about setting the regulations that we would like to see going forward. As part of this process, we did receive 2 written comments. One was included in your packet that went out, and the other one we received today. So that's in front of you this evening at the dais here. Within the city of Woodland Park, we have a definition related to lodging tax and requirements that it gets levied and collected whether it's an apartment or a motel room, guest house, any of those kind of things are rented for a time period of less than that 30 days. And part of administering and collecting those taxes, a business license is required, and that's currently in Title 5. And that's what the city has been doing, is ensuring somebody who is operating this type of business does have a business license and has been collecting the appropriate taxes. So last year, we went through an extensive public engagement process where we identified both the benefits and the impacts associated with short-term rentals. And part of the objective there was an attempt to build consensus on how to address this particular use in our city code. Through there, we had 3 joint work sessions between Planning Commission and City Council. And then it was on September 29th of last year where this board made a recommendation that went to City Council. They amended that recommendation and then adopted Ordinance 1431 in November of 2022. That ordinance was subsequently repealed in February of 2023. So we're basically back to the starting point. That ordinance and the objectives, I think, carry over to this particular ordinance and are still part of what we're looking at. And you see these spelled out in the whereas statements at the beginning of the ordinance. The desire is to protect residential integrity and community character within the city, to adopt licensing regulations and restrictions on the renting or leasing of real property for occupancy of less than 30 days, to ensure clarity, increased enforcement, fairness, and consistency with the goals of the city for its residents, businesses, and customers. And then the subject regulations, we see them as necessary to the health, safety, and welfare of the public, and to prevent adverse impacts to adjacent properties, neighborhoods, and quality long-term rental housing units within the city. Since the 1431 was repealed, City Council had two work sessions, the first on March 2nd and the second on June 1st. And from that, they came with some clear direction that they had asked Planning Commission here to consider. And these reference the pages, and in the packet, there was an annotated ordinance with cryptic red ink on it in terms of trying to flag what the different sections were that they were asking for changes related changes there. So the first one was modifying the definition of a short-term rental. They asked to delete the word utilized. I believe the word leased is in there now. They were asking for caps to be set, but at the current percentage of STRs within zone districts where these would be permitted, the residential zone districts where they would be permitted. There was a desire to amend so that accessory dwelling units could be a short-term rental, provided the owner of the property, it was their primary residence. So it was that accessory dwelling unit that was potentially being used as an STR. They had asked to delete the distance separation requirements. And then there was another provision in there addressing that if it was your primary residence and you were occupying the residence at the time you were leasing of a portion of it as a short-term rental, that these rules and regulations would not apply in that situation. Council had asked that provision be deleted. On page 5 of that ordinance, this next section, they were looking to revise the number of violations that somebody could have. It was originally identified as 1, and they were asking to allow no more than 2 violations. And then the next page 6, when it deals with actual revocation or hearings associated with the licensing, so that was also revised to 2 violations within the past 12 months, and that related to business licenses and good neighbor guidelines. Page 7 is where we start to get into the provisions related to the zoning regulations. So revising that accessory dwelling unit, similar to the licensing situation, so that so long as the owner, it's their primary residence and they're occupying the property, that ADU could then be used as an STR. So that's a similar change. And then on page 8, asking again to delete the distance separation requirements between short-term rentals, revising section 7, which related to transition provisions between business licenses, and then to the short-term rental business license. And then there's a new section 8 that calls for a 2-year review of the caps associated with the licenses. So with that guidance, Planning Commission held work sessions on both June 8th and June 22nd. You all had asked for additional revisions to clarify and clean up some of the wording, add back in those distance separation requirements between the STR units. So that is back to your original recommendation of 500 feet in the suburban residential zone, and then 250 feet in the urban residential and PUD zone districts. You guys asked for a clear distinction between short-term rental units that are someone's primary residence versus those that are not. And then with regard to how caps are set, you rejected caps as a percentage of the number of lots or residences available. And instead, you were asking for no caps on the number of primary residences that are operated as short-term rentals, but are setting caps by zone district as a flat number and 25% below the current number of operating non-primary residence short-term rental units. So that ordinance that you have in front of you has clear numbers based on the analysis that was done. So within the ordinance, the definitions are set out in the front of the licensing provision, Title V. And there's 5 of them that relates to applicant, primary residence, short-term rental business and short-term rental unit, and then lodging tax. Short-term rental business and short-term rental unit also appear in Title 18. With regard to licensing, these provisions were not modified from the ordinance you guys looked at last September. So licenses are required and they're specific to the subject property and the applicant or licensee. Their license number that's assigned to each of these that must be included in the title for all the listing and advertising that they do, including web hosting services when somebody's promoting their short-term rental. And then there's specifications in terms of who can actually be the recipient of said license, and that's one of they need to be the owner of the property as evidenced on the recorded deed, and who's also one of the following: a natural person, trust, if the trustee of the trust is a natural person, or a business entity legally registered with the Colorado Secretary of State to conduct business within the state of Colorado. Those provisions are all consistent with where we were in September. As we discussed, based on your recommendation from a work session to put in this ordinance, caps are established at a flat number. And in these zone districts, and this is the number 25% below the current number of non-primary residence short-term rental units that are operating. So the suburban residential would be 42, urban residential is 28, and planned unit development is 4. There's no caps or maximum number of short-term rental business licenses within the neighborhood commercial, community commercial, service commercial, and central business zoning districts, because those are commercial in nature and lodging is otherwise allowed there. And then short-term rentals are prohibited within the remaining zones of multifamily suburban, multifamily urban, mobile home parks, agricultural, public, semi-public lands, and then the heavy service commercial light industrial zone district. And then caps do not apply to short-term rental units, which are the short-term rental business licensee's primary residence as defined way back at the beginning of Title V. So if it's your primary residence and you're operating that short-term rental, they're not at that same location, you're not subject to the caps. These provisions are consistent in wanting somebody locally available to manage that property. And it's some of the basic things like removal of snow and ice, handling trash and refuse removal, other maintenance requirements, helping both guests and tenants accountable to the good neighbor guidelines. And then when the unit is occupied, they need to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, during that occupancy period, for the purpose of responding within 60 minutes to property code violations or complaints regarding the condition, operation, or conduct of the occupants of the short-term rental unit, and then taking remedial action to resolve such violations and complaints. The items I have underlined here address things that have been changed or further revised, and this is where you see that change, allowing somebody who it's their primary residence and there's an accessory dwelling unit to use that ADU as a short-term rental. And then we've also had conversations on occasions about cabins and other structures without installed water, power, and or sewer facilities. I know there's been conversation about should it be and sewer facilities or sewer facilities. That can come in any combination. So I'm recommending the and or, so it's any combination of that. If you're, because I don't want to end up in the conversation of, well, I have 2 out of 3, so I should be allowed to do this. That's the purpose of that. The short-term rental separation requirement within Title 5, it's referring to chapter or to Title 18, where that's really spelled out in detail, since that's part of the analysis that could functionally happen in the planning office as part of saying yes or no to somebody being eligible for a license. And then it also references parking needing to be established at the time that the applicant or the license is issued or renewed. Those terms or those requirements are further specified within Title 18. With regard to the licensing, they need to apply 30 days in advance of operating. The license is good for 1 calendar year, January 1 through December 31. And they must keep their license information up to date. Licenses are not transferable. And then there's a series of items that must be met in order for the license to be issued. Things like the application is complete, all their fees and taxes are paid. They're meeting all the applicable requirements of the code. There's no current or pending violations. And then when somebody is renewing a license, in addition to those things we just saw listed, they also need to make sure that there's, again, no outstanding violations on the property. That within the last 12 months, there's been no more than 2 cited violations, the provisions of the title, and then no more than 2 violations of the licensing requirements and good neighbor guidelines. Short-term rental business license may be suspended or revoked by the city council after conducting a public hearing. And then there's provisions that spell out what could lead to suspension or revocation, including those numbers of violations. And then a new provision is that if an STR business license is revoked, it is for a minimum of 2 years. And then the penalties section within there still stands. So there was no change to that. And then we shift to the section of the ordinance that addresses Title 18. I already referenced the 2 definitions that you see within Title 18 because we need them in the zoning code also. And then within our table of permitted uses, this is what that table looks like in terms of short-term rental units being permitted conditionally in suburban residential, urban residential, neighborhood commercial, community commercial, service commercial, central business district, and PUD zones. The next section does get into those standards that need to be met in order to operate the short-term rental unit and obtain that license. So they're not permitted in a rental apartment or apartment building at any time in any zone district. The next provision is duplicative of what you saw in Title 5, addressing ADUs and then cabins and other structures, as well as other buildings where or places where an STR would not be permitted. Short-term rental unit shall not be operated in such a way to conduct a nuisance. The maximum number of occupants permitted is 2 people per legal bedroom plus an additional 2 people. Large events such as concerts, parties, and weddings are prohibited. This is where we spell out the minimum parking standard, which is 2 off-street on-site parking spaces for guest vehicles. And all short-term rental units with more than 2 bedrooms need to provide a minimum of 1 parking space per bedroom. And then this is where we reference the caps on the number of licenses that is established back in Title 5. And then I've got 2 text revisions beyond what you saw in your packet. So those are coming up next here. And so with regard to this standard, that establishes the distance separations between short-term rental units. At the very end, that last sentence, we had your classic copy paste error where we missed like the last line in that copy paste. So I apologize for that. And so the second half of that sentence, this really does complete the thought that the separation measurement shall be made in a straight line from the nearest property line of the proposed short-term rental unit to the nearest property line of another short-term rental unit. And then with regard to section 7, these are those transition provisions. The text that you see here in red in the center, there's an additional comma, the deletion of the word or and then adding that the caps established in 5.22. So this was an item that council was pretty committed to or asking about was the legacy provisions. So the folks that are operating one now can continue to operate one provided they get their short-term business rental license taken care of within these first 2 months. And then this is just clarifying that those existing legacy provisions, so long as they keep that current and the ownership doesn't change, they're not subject to the prohibition of STRs in certain zones or the distance separation requirements or the caps established. So those folks, provided their stay in good standing and continue to follow those rules, they can continue to operate. And then section 8 is that new section that talks about every 2 years from the effective date of the ordinance, that council does review those established caps. So with all that, the recommendation is, should the planning commission find the provisions in the proposed ordinance are satisfactory, the commission should recommend that council approve the code amendments, including the staff corrections identified this evening as presented.
Well, thank you, Karen. Any comments or discussion at this point from commission?
It looks like you captured our thoughts and notes accurately. I didn't see any discrepancies from what we discussed at the last work session. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it was helpful that you guys were so clear and that Mr. Brown provided things in writing that you all had discussed very thoroughly. So no, that was hugely helpful. So glad we were able to capture all that.
Well, there's nothing else at this time. We'll go to the public hearing portion of this item. CJ, do we have a list of speakers?
One by one.
Okay. Well, very good. And I don't all rush at once, but if we can come in an orderly manner to the podium, state your name
And then we have several folks online
and
too.
address. Okay, very good. Name and address, please.
My name is Jared Penman, Woodland Park resident and voter. Bear with me, I had a dental procedure this morning and it was pretty major. So this proposed ordinance is an improvement to ordinance 1431. It seemed to me that ordinance 1431 was a way to fulfill the vision of a majority of city council members to allow an investor anywhere in the world to purchase any house in Woodland Park and turn that house into a lodging business. Over 800 Woodland Park voters rejected that vision. Having lodging businesses in our residential neighborhoods is not why we live in this beautiful city. We want to live with neighbors in our neighborhoods. Is that too much to ask for? Trust in our leadership was lost on November the 17th, 2022, pertaining to this issue when ordinance 1431 was passed. There are at least 3 major problems with this proposed ordinance. Under caps, number 1, under caps, lodging businesses will still be allowed to operate forever, including new ones in any house in our SRUR and PUD residential neighborhoods. Legacy STR, number 2, will be allowed to operate their lodging business forever as long as they want to and don't cause any problems. By your definition of problems, in zoning districts where they should never have been licensed in the first place. Business licenses in Woodland Park are given for 1 year with absolutely no guarantee they will be renewed. Why should the city, number 3, why should the city want to license problems? Non-primary resident short-term rental problems are known all over the nation. Your proposed ordinance allows problems to operate where they don't belong in the first place. Nothing that has been tried to date has slowed down our momentum to allow the citizens to decide how to solve our short-term rental problems. We are an anti-STR group. Not so. Such a group will be proposing a total citywide ban on STRs. That's never been us. We are an anti-business group. Not so. We support and encourage STRs in commercial zones that would allow many tourists, family, and friends to stay within walking distance of our downtown businesses. If there are barriers to putting STRs in our commercial areas, those barriers are not ours. We're just saying they're allowed. Those barriers fall on city council to solve. Those antes didn't work. So let's try another one. Anti-visitor. That's not us. You might want to read and understand our ordinance. We encourage STRs of any type in our commercial areas and encourage with no restrictions mom and pop STRs practically anywhere in the city. These are extremely pro-visitor, pro-tourist, and pro-business. So let's try another one. Our ordinance will not allow your family or friends to spend less than 30 days with you. That's a pretty desperate reach to me. The citizen ordinance is clearly an ordinance dealing with short-term rentals, lodging businesses, not short-term visits. This one defies the logic, since the intent is clearly spelled out in the Citizens Ordinance, Section 5. The intent has nothing to do with visits. Rather than go down your path with STR investors, most of which are not even Woodland Park voters if you check it out. Go down the path with hundreds and hundreds of Woodland Park actual citizens verified by City Hall and voters to preserve the character of our neighborhoods. Go down that path with us to maintain the character of the neighborhood, which is the character of the neighborhood, which is the oath of office of our city council and you. Sign our petition, vote with us in the upcoming special election. By your charter as an advisory agency to city council, you could simply pass on the citizens initiative ordinance for city council action rather than a rehash 1431 that the citizens clearly do not want. If you do that, of course, then city council would have Title V to deal with, because we're not dealing with Title V. We're only dealing with where they're allowed and what they're not allowed, and what type is allowed and what type is not allowed where. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Anyone else in the audience wanting to speak?
What's that?
Yeah.
Next.
My name is Deanne and I've lived here 21 years. I would like to talk to you tonight about Good Community Foundation. And I thank you for listening to me. A couple of us or few of us believe that this group of people have the highest integrity of all of the committees that govern Woodland Park. And we think it's because you do not have special interests And you do have the caring for the individual citizens as you're thinking and planning for all of the things that are important to us. We are watching a large number of people move into our small city. There will be 300 next year in an apartment complex, not very far on 67 from my place. And 2 more apartment complexes are coming in. This is our opportunity to create a healthy foundation for many years to come with many more people to come. It's important that our decisions now make a firm foundation. Couple of things at your debate and discussion last week, I think are inadequate, and I'm only going to bring 3 of them out. It was brought up that many cities in Colorado would not want to ban STRs because we are a tourist state. But I just looked up Denver today, and Denver has none unless they're owner occupied. And we could be like Denver. We could have owner occupied only. The other item that was brought up that is a mistake is that we, at preserving neighborhood character, we want all SDRs in commercial. In commercial zones, which actually is what the businesses are right now. This is what your zoning and your codes are right now. Visitors are good for our city in many ways. The item that was talked about was the economic downturn. And I'm only going to bring up 2 things that I researched today too. My property taxes are going up 40%. And so if you take a 40% onto the income of last year's city council income, that would be $5 million more. So we're not going to have an economic problem. I also looked at the retail for the last 3 years, and I averaged out how much the increases were. $770,000 a year increase in local increases in income. So I don't think this is going to affect our economic situation. The last one I'm going to mention is the crabby neighbor one, because a lot of us do know that there are good short-term rentals. And he could have been talking about me. I could be the crabby neighbor. But even if I have a crabby neighbor next door, he trusts me. He knows who I am. He knows that I'm not going to steal anything. I'm not going to ruin his property. I'm not going to play loud music. And if I do, then I will turn it down when he mentions it. And what if he's crabby and he has to have knee surgery and his I'm a registered nurse, and his pre-surgery information was that he can't drive, he has to buy groceries. So his next door neighbor is not afraid of his crabbiness, and all of the neighbors will make sure that he has food to eat while he's recuperating. And that's preserving the foundation of our good neighborhood, where STRs right next door would care less about it. I took notes when we did the referendum only on 12 people's problems. And I'm not going to go over each one of them, but the least problem that I saw was the garbage. But that lady cried when she signed. And I think it's because she's stuck. She has an STR and she's retired right next to the lady 2 houses down. And the garbage was put outside and it was strewn all over their yard. And so both of these women are picking up garbage, but you can't tell Chief Deisler to get out here and give somebody a ticket for garbage. So some of the statistics from the police reports are inaccurate. They're very, very slim. The other thing is, the worst that I think, because there was the big fire that everybody knows about, is the couple who bought a house near the school. And she didn't even tell me this, but the neighbor right across from her said she's going to have a new baby and she has 2 little ones and they have a fenced in yard. But if you have strangers coming in every 3 nights, you can't let your kids play by themselves out in that yard. I think that's the worst case scenario. And I don't know how Chief Deisler is going to monitor any of that. And that destroys the fabric of our community. I know that the planning commission is not here to design and be creative. I've seen your job now, and I very much appreciate all the hard work that you do, and I value your comments. I think that it would be great if you could create a beautiful downtown, or even we're going to need more commercial, we're going to need more zoning if all these people are coming in. And I think that would be the fun part of your job if you had the chance to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next. Anyone in the audience? Want to speak? So CJ, do we have some people online with comments?
We have no hands raised, Chair. I will say if you are online and would like to participate in public comment, please raise your hand. We do have a couple hands raised, Chair. First, let's see, Mary Sawalski, please unmute and speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, please move.
Okay, thank you. This is Mary Sikowski. I'm a Woodland Park resident. My comments will be very brief. I just wanted to thank the Planning Commission for the ordinance that you've discussed and put together. I think it is a workable document that I'm excited to see in front of the City Council, and I hope that it'll get there. I did want to mention a couple of comments from Deanna a minute ago that I just think are ludicrous. You know, Denver passing regulations also has hundreds and thousands of hotels. Woodland Park does not have that. And so there is a unique demand for short-term housing and short-term rentals in Woodland Park that is not applicable to a big metropolitan area like Denver. Also, something I'd like to address is regarding the lady with a child who didn't hear from the lady but heard from the neighbor across the street. I mean, come on, this is rumor and hearsay is how we're basing these decisions. So, I mean, if you're worried about neighbors being strangers being next door, don't go to the parks, don't go to the grocery stores, because you are surrounded by strangers and your kids are surrounded by strangers. So those arguments, sadly, just are ludicrous. And I hope the Planning Commission will dismiss them as not important in this discussion and move forward with the ordinance that you are looking at tonight in this public hearing. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another one, CJ.
Next to speak, we have Mr. Joe Fury. Please unmute and speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay, this is Joe Fury. I've been a Woodland Park resident for about 30 years. And I just would like to say that I believe the Planning Commission got it correct this first time around. Residential means residential, not business, not commercial. And that's the way it should be. If somebody wants to run a business, they can purchase a property in the commercial district or business zones. And to let people turn their houses essentially into a motel without a motel sign just isn't right for the residential, the residential zones. So I really request the Planning Commission to consider that as we go forward with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
We have no more hands raised, Chair.
Okay, entertain anybody in the audience come up again, or not again, but guys come up. And last call for anybody online wishing to speak. Seeing no response, we'll close the public hearing. Thank you. Any comments or discussion? Response to what we've heard?
I'd like to make one comment that we've tried to consider that you guys who are concerned about having any short-term rentals in the residential zones haven't mentioned or discussed. And that is the short-term rentals that are properties that were built 90 plus years ago in Woodland Park by families who've owned them for 3 generations, who have them as short-term rentals. They've been having repeat business from people who've been here for decades, coming to those same properties that are in our residential zones. They might have been here before they were even zoned. And you're saying not allowed, move them to commercial. There's no accommodation for that. I think that presents a problem for the city. Potentially that they could, say, hey, there's no other use for that property. It's not a house, it's a cabin. It's in the urban residential zone. I don't know why it got zoned that way, but so it's few and far between. They're very small in number. But they were here before any of us. Because I'm not 90. I don't think anybody in the room is. So that's one of the things we try to consider in legacy that I think the city council also tried to consider, is that there are some properties that were just here. Also, there's no way we can legislate that there won't be a vacation home in a neighborhood. People bought homes here planning to retire here. We heard from multiple people about that. Their vacation homes, they come part-time during the summer. They leave other times of the year. During economic situations, they want to make a little money off that house, rent it to a friend or other family member or somebody. And that's cases of the worst case scenario for neighborhoods, VRBO or Airbnb. So in many cases, neighborhoods have restrictions. They have HOAs, they have covenants. That takes care of it for a neighborhood. But a neighborhood that doesn't have an HOA or covenants has to get that passed, and they have to get the majority, or actually, I think a unanimous agreement to create that. So that's a problem. So we understand that. So we've heard a lot of these arguments. The ordinance that's before us tonight addresses a reduction in overall licenses over time. The only thing it leaves in place is legacy. It says start where we're at and it'll go down over time. It doesn't eliminate them entirely and change the situation for these people who, in some cases, were here before any of us, doing some sort of short-term lodging in a residential zone. So that's not to be an argument. It's just that's a fact of something we're trying to consider that this ordinance does address. The other thing is, I felt like as a planning commission, we listened to everybody, and all of the issues that people had we tried to address those with requirements of the ordinance. So same way we'd handle somebody who's got a barking dog. You don't say no barking dogs or no dogs in residential zones because they're going to bark, some of them. No, you say an ordinance that says if they bark, they're going to be penalties, and eventually they'll have to do something about the dog to try and regulate that so it doesn't bother the neighbors. So the idea was to create these conditions that the problems that people brought to us would be addressed. So it doesn't eliminate short-term rentals entirely, but it does give us a way to effectively attack the problem STRs where they exist. So that's just my comments on what I heard tonight. Just want to put that out there.
Well, thank you, Ken. Anyone else have comments or response?
If no one's jumping in, I'll give my comments on it.
Please do.
I believe the ordinance, the proposed ordinance is a substantial improvement over 1431, and I think at least one of the commenters acknowledged that. We'll see what ultimately people decide for tonight, but my sense is that the ordinance, as it's proposed, with some balances, some give and some take from other ways, might even be in a position to get a unanimous view from the planning commission, which I know from discussion we have, we come from a lot of different places, a lot of different thoughts on it. And none of us is probably in love with every single provision in it, but we're talking about something which it's an improvement from what's available. I think it sets a trend which is desirable. Some of the particular factors, aspects of the agreement. We do protect the right of the so-called legacy owners to continue. In some cases, there could be some dramatic unfairness to try and stop that. In any event, how to decide those where that unfairness would exist and wouldn't exist would be very difficult to do. I think that's also, we want to be realistic, knowing this goes to the city council. I think there's been some sensitivity there to doing much of anything that would reduce the numbers of the so-called legacy owners. That is a number which will decline over time. I don't know how fast, but it may be surprising as economy changes, interest rates change, other things going on. A number of those may move fairly quickly. We have, as a separate matter, been kind to STR owners that are talking about units that are their primary residence. I think that is a special situation because while there is some lodging going on with a primary residence STR owner, it is nevertheless, as a primary residence, I read that as being the primary use of that property is residential. It may be important for any number of people to be able to afford the lifestyle they've had for some time, to continue to be able on a short-term basis to rent it when they're traveling, when they're away for portions of the year. I think that's a reasonable incident of ownership in a principal residence. As to the numbers involved, I think it's important that we demonstrated the direction we think things could go. I sense Woodland Park does have a substantial view of the citizenry that is negative to STRs. The structure we have proposed here has lower caps in the areas where they're still allowed SR, UR, and PUD. It's structured so it would be very easy over time to reduce those numbers as well. Those numbers are less than what the current legacy owners are. So as the first legacy owners go away over time, they have to have a 25% reduction in them before anyone can start backfilling any of those legacy owners. These are compromises, but they're compromises that seem reasonable. I think have a reasonable chance of being adopted by the city council, and I think are sensitive to the needs of the community and fairness to the existing owners. So those are some of my thoughts on it too. And with that as presented here, I would be supportive of the draft ordinance as presented.
Thank you, Lee. Any other comments? If not, I guess we look for a motion.
I'll make a motion that we approve the ordinance as it was presented through Karen with the provisions and the updates and corrections as presented here tonight to go forward to the city council and to public hearing.
Your second?
Second.
Very good.
Any
comments?
Yeah, I'll mention if I didn't make clear, my preference is for reduced numbers of STRs, but I think this is a sensible way to go and is a workable base, something that's realistic for the city, could be passed and could form a basis for going forward in a way that would allow further reductions in the future.
Anybody? Anything else? Karen, could you take a roll call, please?
Sure. Vice Chair Brown,
Yes.
Ron DeZellem,
Yes.
George Jones,
Yes.
Ken Kennedy,
Yes.
and Chairman Hartsfield.
Yes.
Motion
Please.
carries 5-0.
That concludes the public hearing session. Reports, Karen.
Related to this item, this is targeted for first reading next Thursday, July 6th with City Council. They've made some changes recently to some of their procedures. So first reading of ordinances appears on their consent agenda. And then they should be setting the public hearing for Thursday, July 20th at 6:30 p.m.
What time?
6:30 p.m.
I'll move there.
Council changed their meeting time also. So yes, they now meet at 6:30.
I wasn't aware of that. Thank you.
Yeah. And then I think previously I talked about the city doing a housing needs assessment study at this point. And there is a survey that has gone live. We're about to start promoting it through our city website and such. So please hop on, give your feedback regarding housing here in Woodland Park, because that will be very helpful to the consultant as they work through preparing both data and recommendations to city council.
Any time frame in that survey may be completed and results available.
I don't know when all the results come back, but it's a couple week window for actually having opportunity to complete the survey. And I think it's a couple of minutes. There's like 20 some odd questions. So, but it does move fairly quickly.
Anything else?
I think that's it.
Commissioners have anything to report on? In that case, it's 7:20, meeting's adjourned.